Since early 2025, President Trump has launched the most aggressive U.S. tariff campaign in modern history, and it's still unfolding. We're recording this in late March 2026, just weeks after a temporary 10% global import duty took effect on almost all goods coming into the United States. On paper, this is about making other countries pay. In reality, it's about weaponizing access to the world's biggest historically open market and stress testing a global system that got very comfortable using that openness. Today, I'm going to strip away the slogans and focus on four things: what has actually changed, what the data says about prices and jobs, how AI and bad job design blur the story, and why some protectionist regimes abroad are more fragile than they look. For roughly 40 years before this tariff wave, the United States played a different game than most big economies. We kept our average tariffs low by global standards, tied ourselves into deep supply chains, and allowed imports to surge from countries that kept more protection at home. Think of a mid sized US retailer importing appliances from East Asia. For decades, they paid a low single digit duty and passed that price advantage on to customers. Their foreign suppliers often had higher protection at home, but could sell freely into the US. That's the old game. We run an unusually open market. You mix openness with protection at home and still enjoy our demand. Sit with that for a second. Trump's 2025-2026 tariffs are a hard break from that model. He isn't trying to totally seal the border. He's saying if you built your development strategy on a permanently open US market, that strategy is now a bargaining chip, not a guarantee. Let's anchor this in concrete moves. In April 2025, the White House rolled out a reciprocal tariff framework. A baseline 10% duty applied broadly to imports, with higher rates on countries Washington labeled as keeping unfair barriers or large persistent imbalances. Over the rest of 2025 and into early 2026, that was layered with higher tariffs on key sectors like metals and autos, targeted hikes on major partners and rivals, including China, India, and some allies, ongoing tweaks as court rulings and negotiations forced adjustments. Then, in February 2026, after some earlier measures hit legal limits, Trump invoked emergency authority to impose a temporary 10% duty on almost all imports for 150 days. For a U.S. importer that used to pay, say, a 3% duty on a container of tools, that bill may now look closer to 13 to 15% once you stack all the new measures. That's the difference between hiring two extra warehouse workers this quarter or freezing headcount to protect margin. That's what it looks like in real life. So when I say Trump's tariffs 2.0, I'm talking about this entire 2025-2026 wave, not one press conference. Historically, US tariff waves were slow and legislative. Congress passed broad laws. Smoot-Hawley in the 1930s is a classic example that raised duties across the board as an ideological project. Trump's support is structurally Trump's approach is structurally different in three ways. First, it's executive driven. He leans hard on presidential and emergency powers to move tariffs quickly, often arguing national security or reciprocity. Congress is mostly reacting, not initiating. Second, it's transactional. Tariffs are the opening move, not the destination. You saw this with NAFTA becoming the USMCA, the Phase 1 deal with China, and the sector deals on autos or steel. The message is take the pain now, or we talk. If we talk, maybe I adjust the pain. Third, it's broad but adjustable. Instead of one big law that sits for a decade, you get waves of measures, carve outs, exemptions, and side deals. Market access becomes a volume knob, not an on off switch. Imagine a European car maker building SUVs in Mexico for the US market. Under the old model, they could count on relatively stable access. Under this model, their cost structure and planning horizon depend heavily on where they sit in Washington's friends, problems, and targets list this quarter. That's the part most headlines skip. Let's kill the first lazy narrative. Tariffs automatically bring back 1970s style runaway inflation. Here's what the evidence actually supports. When tariffs go up sharply on a product, the price of that product and close substitutes tends to rise. Some of that extra cost is absorbed by importers in lower margins. Some is passed through to buyers. Take the appliance importer again. If their landed cost on a washing machine jumps by 8 to 10%, they might raise the retail price a little, quietly cheapen components, or cut back on promotions to protect margin. However they slice it, the customer eventually feels a difference. That's what it looks like on a store shelf. But when you zoom out to overall inflation, tariffs are one input among many. Serious estimates put the direct tariff contribution to the broad US inflation at a fraction of the total picture. Energy prices, central bank policy, housing, and post pandemic demand still do most of the heavy lifting. So you can say two things at once and be honest. Tariffs do push prices up in targeted categories. Tariffs do not fully explain the inflation people have lived through. Anyone saying it's all tariffs or tariffs don't matter at all is compressing a messy story into a slogan. Sit with that tension for a second. Second lazy narrative. Tariffs save American jobs versus tariffs kill American jobs. Reality is more uneven. In a protected sector like steel, some U.S. mills have seen better capacity use, higher prices, and some employment gains. On the surface, that fits the tariffs saves jobs story. But now look at a small auto parts factory that buys that steel. Their material bill rises. They can't easily pass all that on to big automaker clients, so they freeze hiring, cut overtime, or shelve a planned second shift. Nobody writes a headline for the second shift that ever opens. That's where the tariffs kill jobs part quietly lives. Add retaliation. A soybean farmer in the Midwest may find that a key Asian buyer switches part of their demand to Brazil in response to US tariffs on something else. The field still gets planted, but the price and the volume looks worse than they did on the spreadsheet 6 months ago. So when economists add it up, sector by sector, they usually find visible job gains in a few protected pockets, harder to see job losses or slower hiring downstream, and in export exposed industries. A net effect on manufacturing employment that's modest and often negative. Tariffs, they matter for jobs. They just don't map cleanly to good or bad at the macro level. They redraw the winners and losers inside the labor market. That's the part most campaign speeches glide over. Let's put that into three near term worlds. Scenario one, managed shock, our base case. In the managed shock path, which I see as the base case, tariffs raise costs and uncertainty. Governments and firms hatch around the edges. The system creaks but holds. You might see a US manufacturer negotiating harder with suppliers, maybe shifting some sourcing to Mexico to stay inside a free trade umbrella, a European exporter eating part of the tariff in the margins to keep market share in the US, a retailer quietly narrowing its product range to keep logistics simpler. Global trade gets noisier and more expensive, but the basic wiring remains intact. This is painful for some firms and households, but it's not a collapse. It's a chronic tax on complexity. That's the world we're in right now. Scenario two, hardened blocks. In the hardened blocks path, tariffs and controls stop being temporary leverage and become part of a fixed economic camps. The US couples tariffs with industrial policy and chips, batteries, and clean tech. China and others harden their own controls and subsidies. Over time, you get a US aligned tech and trade network where firms design around US rules, components, and finance. A China aligned network doing something similar under Beijing standards. A shrinking middle ground for countries that want to sell freely into both. A Vietnamese electronic firm, for example, may find it has to choose between US chips and Chinese chips, between US export controls and Chinese market access. Sitting on the fence becomes harder to sustain. Trade volumes can still be high, but the cost of neutrality goes up. Scenario three, shock escalation. In the shock escalation path, tariffs are just one part of a bigger break. Think a sudden export ban on a key mineral, a broad sanction hit on a major logistics or tech company, a serious disruption at a canal or strait. A European auto plant may discover that a single sanctioned supplier in Asia means weeks of halted production, even if no one ever raised a tariff on cars. In this world, the question shifts from what's the tariff rate to can I even get the thing I need at any price in time? This is where you see real shortages, sharp spikes in food and fuel for fragile states, and protests that start as cost of living anger, not ideology. Hold those three worlds in the back of your mind. They're the lanes we're drifting between. Now back to jobs, because most people feel this there first. The US has been a services and knowledge heavy economy for decades. Most workers are not bending metal, they're in software, marketing, finance, healthcare, logistics, government, and operations. Recent layoff waves reflect that. The biggest cuts have been in tech and other white collar roles, software engineers, analysts, project managers, content people. The jobs that live in documents, dashboards, and calls. Companies often cite AI and efficiency to justify these cuts. But we need to look at what's really being cut. Imagine a product team with 4 people, whose week is mostly slide decks, status reports, and internal dashboards. If one person plus a decent AI stack can cover 80 to 90% of that output, that doesn't mean AI has suddenly replicated deep, irreplaceable value. It means much of that role was producing artifacts that management can live with getting cheaper. That's a harsh way to say AI is often exposing overestimated value, not automating obviously essential work. Or take a support function that writes boilerplate reports. If a model can draft the first pass and a human just edits, you may go from 3 full-time report writers to 1 editor and 1 analyst. Again, the underlying decision might still need humans. What shrinks is the entire time spent packaging it for internal consumption. That's what it looks like on the office floor. This doesn't mean organizations suddenly understand jobs. What's changed is that leaders have a cheaper way to ask, do we really need all of those roles? Sometimes that question is overdue. Sometimes it's reckless and based on no serious job analysis at all. Now layer tariffs and demand on top of that. A firm facing higher import costs from tariffs might use AI as a justification to trim white collar headcount. Another might quietly hold on to core technical staff but cut junior roles whose work is easier to automate or outsource. So when you hear AI is killing jobs or tariffs are killing jobs, understand both are colliding with a labor market that already had a lot of mispriced, poorly understood knowledge work in it. Sit with that for a second. Protectionism, negotiation, and citizens. India is an example. One more hard truth. Countries that refuse to negotiate with the US are not automatically defending their citizens. India is a useful illustration. For many years, India ran high tariffs and heavy restrictions in several sectors. When it began easing some of those barriers in the 1990s and 2000s, especially in textiles and services, export industries and IT services grew quickly. Those changes helped lift tens of millions out of extreme poverty and integrated Indian farms into the global supply chains. That's what a win from easing protection can look like. At the same time, in sectors that remained heavily protected, parts of agriculture, small scale manufacturing, tightly controlled local markets, India still struggles with underemployment, low productivity, and deep regional inequality. Picture a small protected factory selling low quality fans or fridges at prices that would never survive open competition. The owner does well. Workers have a job, but often at low wages and with little prospect of upgrading skills. Families down the street pay a lot for products that break sooner than they should. That's what protection can look like on the ground when it ossifies. The lesson isn't free trade is always good. It's that rigid one way protectionism is a bad long term substitute for building real capacity in good institutions. So when any leader boasts, we refuse to come to the table, we're standing firm. Don't assume that equals we're protecting ordinary people. Very often, it means we're protecting the current winners in this system. That's the part that domestic politics rarely says out loud. Before we close, a quick method note. I'm not asking you to trust me because I sound confident, or to trust Trump, or his critics, or any single expert. The lens I'm using asks 3 questions. Which levers actually moved? Tariff rates, trade flows, prices, jobs, investment? Whose position changed? Governments, firms, households? Who gained options? Who lost them? How stable is that new position? Is this a temporary shock or the start of a new pattern, like hardened blocks or recurring cost spikes? Where the data is strong, I lean into them. Where they're thin or messy, I flag that. The point is to replace "trust me, I'm an expert" with "here's exactly what moved, here's what that plausibly means, and here's what we don't know yet." So, where does that leave us? Trump's 2025-2026 tariff wave is less about sealing the US off and more about charging a cover at the door of a still dominant market. It has raised specific prices, shifted specific jobs, and rattled protectionist strategies aboard. But it hasn't, on its own, either rescued American workers or destroyed globalization. It has made the old protect at home, export freely to America model a lot less stable. And it's colliding with a knowledge economy where AI is exposing how poorly many roles were designed and valued. In future episodes, we'll look at how these trade moves interact with technology, money, and security to shift who really has room to act on the world stage. For now, ignore the hashtags. Watch tariff rates. Watch prices in specific sectors. Watch hiring patterns. And watch which countries quietly change course. That's where the real story lives. I'm Dr. Curt Rasmussen. This is Global Power Shifts. I'll see you in episode 4.